Now we are going to examine the effects of another kind of government price control. So we are going to talk about now this time price floor. For this reason, we will look at a very important example, which is price floor. Price floor example is the minimum wage. Minimum wage laws dictate the lowest price for labor that an employer may pay. The U.S. Congress first instituted a minimum wage with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 to ensure workers a minimally adequate standard of living. When we look at today, the minimum wage, according to federal law, is $7.25 per hour. Some states mandate different numbers, but on general in Texas, it's $7.25. So we will look at if there is a minimum wage in the market, how can this affect the labor market? Remember the labor market. When you look at the labor market, you see now the labor supply is going to be the part, labor supply is the part workers, because they supply their labor. And the demand side is the firm. So they demand labor hours. Here is price. Instead of price, we see the wage, because every labor hour is cost wage to the firm. And on the horizontal side, you see the number of labor hours that people want to supply, workers want to supply based on the wage rate in the market. So to examine the effects of minimum wage, we must consider the market for labor. Here is the market as you see in this, like all markets, subject to forces of supply and demand. Workers determine the supply of labor and firms determine the demand. If the government doesn't intervene, the wage normally adjusts to balance labor supply and demand. As you see in this example, it's $6. So this is without price controls here. Here is you see the minimum wage with the price floor. Here in this graph, the minimum wage is above is below the equilibrium level, as it is here. The quantity of labor supplied is less than the demand. Okay. The result is actually not very changing the equilibrium price, because price floor says that the minimum you can pay for a labor is $5. But $5, the firms are not going to find enough labor because there's going to be less supply. Okay. Because of this reason, the price is going to adjust to its equilibrium level in order to fill the empty spots. The firms are going to agree to pay $6, and $6 is a legal price, because you cannot pay $4. It's not possible if you have a $5 minimum wage, but you can pay $6 because it's above the price floor. Okay. So because of this reason, since firms are looking for labor, the price is going to adjust with the forces of market, supply and demand to $6. So for this reason, a minimum wage below the equilibrium level is not binding. That means the equilibrium wage rate is still a legal price if you impose the minimum wage of $5. Now let's look at in this case. As you see in this case, the minimum wage is above the equilibrium level, and the quantity of labor supplied, here as you see, the quantity of labor supplied, 550 labor hours workers are ready to supply, exceeds the quantity demanded, which is 400 labor hours, for instance. The result is unemployment. Why? Because there is going to be a labor surplus of labor. And the minimum wage raises the incomes of those workers who are working, that finding a job. But unfortunately, which is around 400 hours of labor can be filled with this $7.25 of the wage. But it lowers the incomes of workers who cannot find job. To fully understand the minimum wage, keep in mind that the economy contains not a single labor market, but many labor markets for different types of workers. The impact of the minimum wage depends on the skill and the experience workers. So highly skilled and experienced workers are not affected because their equilibrium wages are well above that $7.25. For those workers, the minimum wage is not binding at all. The minimum wage has its greatest impact, as you realize, to the market for teenage labor, The equilibrium wages of teenagers are low because teenagers are among the least skilled and least experienced members of the labor force. In addition, teenagers are often willing to accept lower wages in exchange for on the job training. As a result, the minimum wage is binding more for teenagers than for other members of the labor force. Many economists have studied how minimum wage laws affect the teenage labor. So researchers compare the changes in minimum wage over time with the changes in teenage employment, and they realize that if there is an increase in the minimum wage around 10% with the data, they find out that there is going to be an unemployment increase or a drop in employment of 1 to 3%. So, in addition to altering the quantity of labor demanded, the minimum wage alters the quantity supplied, as you see here. Because the minimum wage raises the wage that teenagers can earn, it increases the number of teenagers who choose to look for jobs. And studies have found that a higher minimum wage influences which teenagers that are in high school they choose to drop out and take jobs, and these new dropouts displace other teenagers who had already dropped out of school and who now become unemployed. So the minimum wage is a frequent topic of debate, as you realize. Economists are about evenly divided on the issue. Some will argue that minimum wage is good, some will against it, and there are several reasons they believe the minimum wage is good or bad. Usually, advocates of the minimum wage view the policy as one way to raise the income of the working poor. They correctly point out that workers who earn the minimum wage can afford only a meager standard of living. Which is true, because $7.25 per hour, two adults working 40 hours a week for every week of the year at minimum wage jobs had a total income of $30,000 a year, which is less than 2/3 of the median family income in the United States. On the other hand, opponents of minimum wage contend that it's not the best way to combat poverty. They note that a high minimum wage causes unemployment, encourages to encourage teenagers to drop out of the school, and prevents some unskilled workers from getting on the job training they need. Also, opponents of the minimum wage point out that it's a poorly targeted policy. Okay. Not all minimum wage workers are heads of the household. These are usually teenagers who are looking for extra income, extra spending. Here is the result of the minimum wage. As you see, minimum wage creates an unemployment because the supply of labor is higher than the demand for labor. And minimum wage do not affect high-skilled workers because their equilibrium wage is above it, like $15 an hour, maybe $20 an hour. So as you see, price floors do not usually affect if they are not binding if they are below the equilibrium level. Minimum wage usually affect the teen workers, and studies, as I said before, show that a 10% increase in the minimum wage raises teen unemployment by 1 to 3%.